For those of you who don't know me, I'm Alex Colodi. We're going to talk about spring techniques for fishing for bass. There's a wide variety of baits and lures you can choose from. I'm just going to cover the basics that I use and use successfully in every body of water in New York State and other states. All right. What we're going to start with is crankbaits. Crankbaits are a very unique, specialized type of bait to choose from. There's many different styles, forms, shapes, colors, sizes. All right. There's a few standards that I suggest and I always use in the springtime. And the number one bait to use is a mid-depth running. It's a crankbait that runs about 2 to 5 feet deep. It's a square bill. Actually, I'll rip this off and I'll pass it around. It's a square bill. You can see that bill is not round. It's not coffin build shape. It's got a little square edge on it. It's got like little 90-degree angles on that. What that type of crankbait is good for is shallow water fishing. Springtime, when you say springtime, you're fishing anywhere from 10 feet to 6 inches of water, depending on the time of the spring, water temperature, sunlight penetration, certain cover you may be fishing. Let's say you go out in Sodus Bay. That's a common place a lot of people like to fish. You're going to go back into some of the creek mouths. You're going to fish real tight to the shoreline, and you want to throw a crankbait. That's what I would suggest. Square bills, what they do and allow you to do is bounce it off rocks, bounce it off wood. They're not that great around heavy weeds. If you're in heavy weeds, you want to go with something a little different. I would suggest a spinnerbait. We'll get to that topic in a minute. But square bill crankbaits are fantastic baits for the springtime. Color selection, I use chartreuse and blue. They like to call it citrus shad if you're going to buy them on the internet. White and black, white and purple. The reason for the real bright colors is a lot of times in the spring you get some water runoff. Water gets a little stained, might be even a little bit muddy. The real bright colors help the fish locate the bait a little easier. At the same time, I have a little theory about when the water is real cold, the bass like the brighter baits to begin with. If you're not into the real bright baits or they're not biting the real bright baits, what I like to go is a natural style, what I call, these are live target gizzard shad. In the springtime in any of the bodies of water, thank you. In the springtime in any of the bodies of water off Lake Ontario, you get a lot of shad and Niagara minnows that move in and out of the lake. And these made by live target, these gizzard shad are kind of like a spitting image of an actual gizzard shad per se. They work really well. That's a rattle trap. I'll go on to that topic in a second. But if you match the hatch, if they're not biting the real bright colors, the chartreuse, the whites, the white and blacks, the white and purples, go to a gizzard shad color, go to a shad pattern, silver and black, silver and blue, anything that's got some flash and looks more towards natural. All right. If that doesn't work, all else fails, I'll throw a perch pattern. That's another live target perch pattern crankbait. That works really well. Now, size of the crankbait, when I'm saying size, weight and length of the crankbait. In the springtime, I don't go much bigger than this. This is an RC2. Okay, this is made by Lucky Strike. It's a common crankbait. They sell them at Walmart. They're like $5 a pop. That's about the size range I would go. This is about a 3/8 ounce to a 1/2 ounce. I can't remember how heavy this actually is, but it's in that size range. All right. I actually like baits that are the next size down would be the RC1 or a bait that's about 2 inches long. This is about 2 1/4, 2 3/8 long. A little bit smaller profile bait in the colder temperatures in the early spring. The bass are a little bit more lethargic. They're a little more apprehensive to biting a larger bait. The reason being is when the water's cold, bass metabolism is slow because they're cold-blooded fish. All right, so it takes them a little longer to digest a bigger bait. So a smaller meal is easier for the fish to eat, easier for them to digest, easier for the fish all around to eat and ingest more fish at the same time. And in the spring around here, Lake Ontario, all the bays on Lake Ontario, even some of the Finger Lakes, there's large population of small bait fish. Canisius Lake, Honeoye, they got a lot of fat heads. Some of them they actually have Niagaras in them. In Irondequoit Bay, Sodus Bay, Fairhaven, Port Bay, you get a lot of Niagaras that come in out of the lake. You got a lot of small or perch and baby sunfish from the spring before that are swimming around. So that's a good color choice and good size range to chase those fish down with. Now, if you're in a body of water that, let's say you would a Canisius Lake has a real big smallmouth population in it, okay? You may not know that, but they're there. Early spring, catch a lot of big smallmouth in there in 3 to 4 feet of water. You find where there's some rock flats, cast small crankbaits, little jigs, little tubes, stuff like that. But in that lake, the water tends to be very clear, so you want to try to be a little bit more natural. That's where these, the more natural presentations, such as the live targets and other natural-looking baits, come into play. So with the crankbaits being said, the next rattle or hard style bait I would use is a lipless crankbait, or also known as a rattle trap. A lot of people call them rattle traps. Lipless crankbait's the actual name for the broad category. Rattle trap is a trade name. This is a lipless gizzard shad made by Live Target again. What's good about these is if the water's muddy, you can hear these coming from a mile away. All right. This one's real bright in color, but has no rattles. You can get crankbaits with rattles, but you have to kind of shake the package and kind of decipher whether it's the hooks rattling around the package or not. You get a lipless crankbait, 99% of them have rattles in them. Each one has a little bit different rattle, different sound. Some companies make them with a one knocker, which is like a one big giant BB, so it's got a knock, knock, knock instead of a rattle sound. I suggest buying both. They both work extremely well. The one knock sometimes is better than all the rattles, okay? Springtime, I find rattle traps work the best when the water is warming from about high 40s into the low 50s. The fish are starting to come in, they're starting to get real active, they're starting to move around. They're getting that feed bag on, they're getting big, fat, and happy to get ready to get for the spawn. When they're spawning, they're not chasing fish too much. They want to, increase their body fat content and just get big, fat, and happy so that when they're actually spawning for the few days, they don't have to worry about feeding and sustaining energy to hatch their eggs and spawn and all that. So the rattle traps work extremely well. And again, if you get muddy, murky water, you can get away with a natural pattern, but again, in the muddy, murky water, you get the real bright color crankbaits, chartreuse and blue, white and black, white and blue, white and purple. They work extremely well. So that's just a nice little arsenal to have. And again, in the end, if you have any questions on crankbait styles, if you have something you don't know if it's any good, if you want to ask me, feel free to ask me. I'll be more than happy to help you out. All right. So we covered the rattle traps. One last thing on the rattle trap sizes. This is a 1/2 ounce. I would not go anything over a 1/2 ounce in the springtime. Reason being is they sink too fast. These do not float. These sink. Okay? They're going to sink like a rock, depending on what brand you buy. Some of them sink faster than others. These live targets are pretty good. They stay somewhat high in the water column. I like Cordell Super Spots. It's a company that makes hard style baits. They're a little bit different. They're a little lighter. A half ounce Cordell Super Spot is about that much bigger, but it's the weight factor. It doesn't sink as fast. You can reel them a little slower, keep them a little higher in the water column. And when you're fishing shallow, you want something that stays up a little higher so you're not getting stuck in the logs, because these aren't exactly snag proof, okay? When you're throwing a square bill crankbait, that bill is hitting the bottom and rooting around and hits something and bounces off. That's good refraction off a stump, off a rock. When you're running with these, it's going to hit something, roll over, and the hook's going to get caught. So you don't really want to fish these on the bottom. Unless you have a whole pile of them and you don't mind losing a few, then there's actually a decent pattern to fish them like that. But I highly suggest if you're just going out to have some fun, catch some fish, don't let those sink to the bottom. As soon as they hit the surface, start reeling them, because they're going to naturally sink down a few feet, depending on your speed of your retrieve, and stay in that strike zone for a while. All right? Now with crankbaits, there's just a basic rod and reel line setup that I suggest. What I use a fiberglass rod. It's an actual crankbait rod. They make them specifically for crankbaits. But if you're getting that specific, you're going to spend some money on it. You don't have to go this in depth. Your standard rod that you buy off the shelf for any type of fishing will work. What I suggest is using monofilament. Anybody know what the difference between monofilament and fluorocarbon is?
Fluorocarbon sinks more, the monofilament will float.
Correct.
And I think the fluorocarbon, is it more brittle in the colder weather?
Fluorocarbon in the colder weather tends to coil more because it's got more of a memory to it. The only thing with fluorocarbon is once you nick it, it breaks a lot easier than monofilament does. Monofilament is the cheapest line you can buy. It's like $5, $6 for a 300-yard spool. When you're fishing with crankbaits, if you're just getting out, you're just getting started with it, highly suggest between 10 and like 14-pound test monofilament, all right? The reason why I say you can get away with your standard rod with crankbait fishing with monofilament is monofilament has got stretch in it. It's like a rubber band, okay? Fluorocarbon has a little bit of stretch, not as much as monofilament does. Then you go to braided fishing line, it has no stretch, all right? And what that stretch allows you to do is when you're fishing a crankbait with big treble hooks on it and that bait's moving through the water, bait's moving one way, fish is going the other way, they collide. You need that stretch, you need that give, so when that fish hits that bait, you don't rip the hooks out of their face, okay? That's why I say monofilament is the go-to for crankbait fishing. A lot of guys will fish fluorocarbon and braid, but when you're seeing them fish fluorocarbon and braid on TV, they're using very specific rods that are really soft in action. Again, this is a crankbait rod that's really soft in action. It's got a lot of whip to it, and what that soft rod does, it allows for give. For when that fish hits that bait, rod gives a little bit and then loads up and sets the hook so you're not actually ripping the hook out of the fish's face. So there's a little bit different in action, but again, your standard rod, standard 10, 12-pound monofilament, 14 is probably as much as I would go for just anybody fun fishing. I do go up to 20-pound test monofilament, but that's in certain situations. The reason why I would go to 20 is the larger line diameter or the more pound test you're using. 10-pound test, use this bait on 10-pound test, it's going to run about 5 feet deep, okay? Use this bait on 20-pound test, it's going to run about 3 feet deep. Because monofilament tends to float a little bit, the larger line diameter causes more restriction in the water column and doesn't allow that bait to run as deep. So if you're fishing a shallow flat and you have access to another pole with a little bit heavier line and you're fishing a crankbait and you know you're catching them on that crankbait but you're going a little too deep, try switching up to a heavier line. It'll keep that bait from running as deep on you and potentially keep you from getting snagged as much. All right. I like to fish on bait casters. This is an older style reel. I personally like these for crankbaits, but what I do with these is I take them all, take them apart, upgrade the bearings in them, upgrade the drag in them, I tweak them. They're basically an old shell with $150 worth of gears and bearings inside. So I have access to that and I know how to do it. I don't suggest buying a reel and taking it apart and because you might destroy a reel and forget how it goes back together and you might have to pay somebody or throw it away to have it fixed. So I don't suggest doing that. You can get away with crankbaits with a spinning reel. It doesn't matter what type of reel you're using. You can use a spin cast or a push button reel. It doesn't matter. As long as you got some decent quality line on there and a decent rod, you can fish any type of bait you really want on it. All right?
What's the advantage of the bait casting as opposed to open face?
Well, you're more accurate with a bait caster, okay? When you're using a spinning reel, you're casting it out, you're not controlling the line, okay? Spinning reel, you open the bail, you cast it out, the line's just kind of going, and then you kind of eyeball where it's going to stop, and you stop it with your hand or you let it hit the water, all right? With a bait caster, your thumb is constantly on the spool, because when you press in and release the spool, this is free spooling, all right? So if you're not controlling the bait caster, not controlling the speed of your lure, not controlling the distance of your lure, yeah, you can get a real long cast, but you're not going to be accurate. But when you get good at this, you can hit that pole right there on the floor with a bait caster just by casting it and thumbing the line and controlling the fall of the bait and the speed of the bait and the direction of the bait. And you can actually, if you get good enough with a bait caster, you can cast around a pole to get to another pole behind it by making an angle, thumbing the line, holding the pole in a different direction, and the bait will actually make a curve around something. Then you can fish it by the structure and knock it off the structure. That's another key thing when you're fishing crankbaits. In the springtime, you get on a certain flat, you can make a crankbait cast it anywhere, fan cast with it, catch fish. But in certain days, they get a little bit picky. You see a log in the water. You want to throw that crankbait as close to that log as you can, bounce it off the structure a little bit, make it deflect. When that bait's coming through the water, hits the log and deflects or kicks out to the side. A lot of time that trigger strikes, gets fish that are looking at it active and gets them moving on it. They come in and take a peek and want to eat it. All right. Any questions on crankbaits before I move on to spinnerbaits? All righty, no problem. Spinnerbait fishing is a little different. I like to use braid with my spinner baits. This is a 6-foot, 3-inch Team Iowa Light and Tough green handle style rod. I got 30-pound braid on here. It's a Quantum Kinetic PT. They actually stopped making these. They're real low profile. I like them, like the way they sit in my hand. They fit perfectly in my hand. I kind of have small palms with big fingers, so they fit nice. And what a shorter rod allows you to do, especially in the springtime, you're fishing closer to stuff. You're not out in the open for the most part. A short rod is very accurate. The shorter the rod, the more accurate your cast is going to be because it's an extension of your arm. This is a 7-foot crankbait rod. What the length of the rod allows you to do is get a longer cast. So if you're fishing crankbaits, you might be fishing a flat. You might want a real long cast to cover a lot of water quickly. Sometimes when you're fishing spinnerbaits, it's more of a presentation style fishing where you're throwing it up against logs, you're throwing it around a clump of weeds, you're throwing it down the side of a dock, you're throwing it, by a marker buoy or something like that. So you want to be a little bit more accurate with it. So I tend to go with a shorter rod. You can use whatever you have. You don't have to go out and buy anything special for this. You can use spinnerbaits on monofilament, fluorocarbon braid, whatever you choose. These are a little bit different style of a bait. They have real big giant hooks on it. If you can see that gap on that, that's almost a 3/4 inch, maybe a little less, a little bit more than a 3/4 inch gap. It's a big hook. When a bass comes and eats a spinnerbait, it's a little different than fishing a crankbait. Because that hook is so big, when they close their mouth on it and you set that hook, it's actually going through cartilage as opposed to the little tiny gaps on these crankbaits where you're just skin hooking them or hooking them in the flesh, all right? Those will tend to rip out. You get a good strong hit on a spinnerbait and you set the hook, usually they're not getting away from you. Then if they're a little less aggressive, you can run a trailer hook on a spinnerbait. It's just a second hook, it sits a little further back, so if they're coming up at it and nipping at it short, you're going to catch them on the trailer hook as instead on the main hook, all right? Fishing spinnerbaits, again, 1/2 ounce is about as big as I would go. That's a 1/2 ounce. That's a Stanley wedge, okay? It's one of the brands that I promote and that I actually use a lot of. Stanley wedge, Stanley Vibrashaft. There's some of the most popular spinnerbaits on the market. There's some of the higher end spinnerbaits on the market. They use top quality premium blades, mustad hooks. They've been around for a long time. I've been using them for a long time. I'm not a fan of the spinnerbaits that have titanium wire. I like the old, steel wire, thin steel wire. The thinner the wire the diameter, the more vibration the blades give off, the better the spinnerbaits react to your fishing them. There's several size spinnerbaits and styles of blades that I like to fish. These are double willow leaf right here. That's it's probably a size 3.5 or a 4, and that's like a 2.5 size blade. That's a standard combination, willow leaf blade combination, okay? What these are good for is shallow water, sunny days, overcast days. If I was gonna fish a spinnerbait in overcast days, I'd probably go double gold blades. Sunny days, it doesn't matter what color blade you're using. The gold blades reflect a little bit more flash, a little bit more light. The silver blades work well, as they just don't emit as much flash and much light off of them. That's why I like the double gold on cloudy days, because there's not as much sunlight penetration. All right. Then you have, which is almost a willow leaf. This is called an Indiana style blade. I'll pass that one around with the other one so you can see the difference between them. All right. That's a 3/16 or a 1/4 ounce. I'll open this one up too. This is another Stanley spinnerbait that I like. It's a Stanley Wedge Plus series. It's an 1/8 ounce size, just a smaller profile. You can use it in shallow water. You can use it on lighter rods. You can use it on a spinning rod, bait cast, or whatever you want to use. Again, this has double willow leaf blades on it, all right? And then there's a Stanley small fry that I like. This is for real finicky fish, real cold fronts, real lethargic fish. It's got a single Colorado blade on it. Now, a lot of you are saying this is really small, kind of looks like somewhat of a panfish bait. I catch a lot of big fish in the springtime on small spinnerbaits like this, more so than on these bigger spinnerbaits. Again, it's a smaller presentation. You're reeling it a little bit slower. It's in the strike zone a little longer. The fish tend to see it. It's an easier, slower moving bait, so they're going to come up and investigate and probably take a bite at it. But I'm going to pass these around, these smaller ones, since I don't have them tied on. Willow leaf. The chartreuse with the gold, that's an Indiana-style blade, and then that's a Colorado blade, okay? So I'm going to pass them around. If you have any questions about them, feel free to ask me. All right. Spinnerbait colors, you can see, as you see the one when it's going around, it's chartreuse, two different, like a chartreuse and a lime green. That's a real good springtime color. It works well in clear water and in murky water because it's got a lot of color to it, a lot of flash to it. Then you're going to see there's one that's kind of like, they call it fire tiger, orange, chartreuse, green, black. What that's imitating is a perch, a sunfish pattern. All right, then there's another one that's like a bleeding shad pattern. It's got silver and gold and black and red in it. Spinnerbaits come in all colors, all sizes, all blade combinations. You can go wild with spinnerbaits. You can have a box this big full of spinnerbaits and have every color under the sun, but you don't need all those. You need a few colors. I would suggest getting a chartreuse color, a white, silver and white, and maybe a silver and black. Color your color combinations, your shad patterns, your chartreuse patterns. Get a few different sizes. I would suggest getting a few of the smaller ones, the 1/8 ounce, the 1/4 ounce, a couple of 3/8, and maybe a 1/2 ounce or two, depending on where you're planning to fish. All right. Spinnerbaits, again, work excellent for largemouth because they're somewhat weedless. Okay, you can use spinnerbaits over weeds and through sparse weeds because they're an inline bait. When you're reeling that through the water, that bait's coming through the water like that. The hooks are pointing up, okay? The hooks are pointing up on that, so they're not rolling over, not rolling sideways to hook any of the weeds. So you can tend to reel these through open weeds a little easier than a crankbait would be. So if I was on a weed flat in the springtime, there's some old sparse clumps of weeds, and the fish are in the weeds or near the weeds, I might choose a spinnerbait, throw it over the top of them, throw it next to one, maybe throw it behind it, let it sink a little bit and try to rip it through the weeds. That's one technique that works extremely well with spinnerbaits, and that's why I use it on braid. That's my choice of line, like I said. With the braid, you throw a spinnerbait, you make a real long cast. If you get a little bit of weeds on there, you give the rod tip a real sharp, short jerk. Usually with the braid, because there's no stretch, it emits a really erratic action to the blades, and usually you can knock that weed off. So you're not wasting a whole cast and having to reel it in, take the weed off, and make another cast. It's just more efficient that way. But again, you don't have to waste money on braided fishing line. You don't have to, change everything you're doing. If you have monofilament works great. You don't have to have any type of special rods. You can fish them on spinnerbait rods. You can fish them on a crankbait rod. Again, standard equipment will work for this technique. Again, I like bait casting reels for this. They're a little bit more accurate. The other thing that a bait caster has over a spinning reel is more pulling power. A bait caster is basically like a winch. The winch on your boat trailer, per se, that's basically a 1-to-1 gear ratio bait caster, all right? They make several different speeds. This is a burner. It's a 7.0 to 1 gear ratio. It's a real high-speed retrieve. I believe it retrieves 30 inches per handle turn. So with the spinnerbaits, again, start small, work your way big into the as the water temperature warms up. Right now, because we've had such warm weather, we've had several days in the high 70s, low 70s. The nights are staying in the 50s and 60s. A lot of the water bodies around here in New York State are warming up extremely fast. They went from last week, they were in the 50s, to this week, they're 62 to 70 degrees, depending on where you are, and water color and water clarity plays a big part in that. The bass are already starting to spawn, starting to make their beds and getting ready to spawn, depending on what bodies of water you're on, all right? So with that being said, you can tend to fish your baits a little faster because the water's warming up a little bit. When the water's, again, in the 40s, you want to fish a little bit slower than you normally would. And the water's in the 50s, you're still fishing slower than you normally would, but a little faster than it was in the 40s. All right. Fish, you got to remember, bass are cold-blooded animals. When you're looking for bass, if you have access to a boat and you're out in a lake looking for bass, you find the shallow flats. Look at your map. It's going to show topographic lines real far apart. Might have a 2-foot topographic mark or a 3-foot topographic mark. Go in that area, search it out. See if there's any weeds, see if there's any logs, see if there's any rocks or any docks in that area. That's bottom structure habitat that those fish are going to gravitate towards when they're getting ready to spawn. 2 reasons. Structure to spawn against. Bass don't like spawning out in the open because they feel that it leaves their eggs and their fry vulnerable to other prey to come in and eat their eggs. Sunfish, frogs, turtles, other bait fish will actually come in and eat bass eggs. Bass kind of instinctively, there's a log right here. I'm going to spawn as tight to this log as possible, kind of protect. If you're backed into a corner, your back's protected, but you're protecting the front. That's how a bass kind of thinks when they're on their beds. They try to protect their fry as much as possible. A bass may lay 30,000 eggs, and 2% of those make it to fry size. And out of that 2%, maybe 1% actually make it to juvenile stage, where they're about 1.5 inches. Out of that 1%, you might get half of that percent that make it to adult stage. So out of 30,000 eggs, you might get 4 fish make it to adult stage, which sounds like very, very little, but actually, if you have every fish that's out there spawning, creating 4 more fish at minimum, that population just continues to grow and grow and grows quickly. So certain bodies of water like farm ponds and stuff like that, they have a lot of small little bass in them. That's a body of water that's stunted. There's too many small fish in there. There's not enough big prey in there to eat the smaller bass and to attack the bass while they're on their beds and eat their eggs and whatnot. So those are good places to learn how to fish certain techniques. Small fish are real active in the ponds. Ponds warm up the first thing in the year. Ponds are always more active than lakes are earlier in the season. You get a couple sunny days, no ice on the pond. Go down to a pond near your house. A lot of the housing tracts around the newer homes have ponds that a lot of the homeowners don't mind you fishing. Almost all of them are filled with bass. Bass, sunfish, crappie. Some of them even have pike in them. Some of them have the pond by my parents' house has smallmouth in it, and it's only 6 feet deep. So you wonder where a lot of these fish come from, but to be honest with you, a lot of the ponds that are in New York State, this DEC goes in and throws fish in. Reason why they put fish in housing tract ponds is to control mosquito populations, to control leech populations, to control all types of different aquatic inverts that crawl out of the water and cause homeowners havoc, such as gnats and mayflies and whatnot. Fish actually eat the larvae of mosquitoes, mayflies, dragonflies, anything that hatches a bug in the water, the fish are going to eat it. So there's a lot of ponds around that people don't fish. Brighton Henrietta Town Line Road ponds, a lot of big fish in those. There's a lot of ponds out in the Greece area that are housing tract ponds that are full of fish. A lot of ponds out in Webster that are full of fish and nobody fishes. Stop by the one by your house, make a few casts. You might be surprised how many fish you catch and how big the fish are. I know certain people that have caught 8-pound bass out of farm ponds. And it's the biggest fish of their life, and they fish tournaments, and they fish all over the place. Biggest fish they ever catch in a pond. So it's worth trying, worth stopping and giving it a whirl. All right. Now, we talked about crankbaits, we talked about lipless crankbaits, we talked about spinnerbaits. All right. If none of those are working, I do a couple of different things. Especially when the water's a little cooler. I call it finesse fishing. There's a few different style baits that I like to use. Again, one's a standard tube jig. That's a 3.5 inch finesse tube. All right. Bass Pro Shop makes them. Hog Lines is a new soft plastic company that I'm associated with. We have soft plastic tubes in the 3.5 to 4.5 inch range. Small finesse worms, a 4-inch finesse worm. In the springtime, I suggest straight tail worms. That's a straight tail worm. I'll pass that around. We'll start over here. We're always starting the other end there. That's a straight tail worm. This is a paddle tail one, a small paddle tail one. The reason why I suggest straight tail worms is there's not a lot of action in them, okay? In the springtime, when the fish are not as active, they're not moving around as much, you throw something out there that's going like this in their face, they know the water's extremely cold, they know the actual prey in that body of water is not moving like this, they may not bite it because it doesn't look natural. You throw a straight tail worm in there, it's going to hit the bottom, it's going to sit there, and it's not going to move unless you move it, all right? So if the water's, let's say, in the 40s, and you're using a straight tail worm, or you're using a tube jig, all right? You throw it out there, you let it hit the bottom, you drag it real slow, you stop it. You drag it real slow, you stop it, because when the water's in the 40s and 50s, What you're imitating with a tube jig, you're imitating with the straight tail worm is either a crayfish, some sort of a leech, you know, aquatic worms, stuff like that that are on the bottom. They're just crawling out of the mud at that point in time, coming out of hibernation, so they're not going to move real fast. So you want to imitate what the bait fish are doing. As the water warms up, you can increase your speed of your patterns, increase the fishing speed that you are comfortable with. A lot of people can't fish slow. A lot of people have problems slowing themselves down because they're not used to fishing that way. If you think you're fishing slower, fish as slow as you possibly can. If you're throwing it out there and you're making a cast and it's taking you 2 minutes to reel it in the early spring, slow it down even more and make it a 3 or 4 minute cast instead of a 2 minute cast. You'll be surprised how many more bites you get by slowing down your retrieve, all right? Water temperature in the 50s, speed it up a little bit more, vary the retrieve, see what the fish are doing. Fishing for bass is critical, paying attention to little nuances of what the fish do. Pay attention to how you're making a cast, how you're retrieving your bait. You might move it a little differently than you did on the first cast. And that second cast, you get that bite. Think about what you did on that cast that resulted in a fish, okay? If you're throwing it out there and you're dragging it for a couple of casts, you're not getting bites, but you throw it out there and you're popping it off the bottom, letting it sink to the bottom, popping it and letting it sink, then all of a sudden you get a bite. Well, throw it back out there, do the same retrieving again. If you get another bite, obviously that's the pattern you want to fish. They're on that style bait, they're on that style of retrieve, okay? Fish it like that until they stop biting it. When they stop biting, vary your retrieve again until you get another bite, and then copy that retrieve until they stop biting that style, all right? There's many ways to fish. There's a lot of different things you can do. Bass fishing isn't just throw a bait out there and reel it in. There's a little bit more to it. A lot of people like to say, well, bass fishing is easy. You throw a worm out there, you reel it in, the bass are going to eat it. Bass, you know, eat anything you throw at them. They don't really eat everything you throw at them. There's a lot of people that go out there and don't catch fish and tend to get skunked, per se. And that's what I'm here trying to improve your catch ratio and make your trips on the water a little bit more successful. All right. And again, when the water tends to warm up a little bit more, I'll go to curly tail grubs. If you're fishing crankbaits and they stop biting a crankbait, go to a curly tail grub. You can throw these out. Reel them in nice and slow, the tail's wiggling, you can twitch them, jerk them, make them move erratic, and a lot of times you can get fish to trigger that way. And again, for those of you that like to fish smallmouth out in Lake Ontario, the Finger Lakes, right now the smallmouth, because of the water temperature, are moving in real shallow. They're in 2 or 3 feet of water down in the Finger Lakes. They're making beds down there. You can see them from a couple of yards away. You can make casts at them. Tube jigs are fantastic to throw at smallmouth in the rocky areas. The reason why the smallmouth are in there, they're up there feeding on the crayfish. Crayfish are big this time of year. They're just all coming out of the rocks. They get up in the shallows. They start sunning themselves. They start warming up. Crayfish, once they get warm, they're also cold-blooded animals. They start to feed on the dead, decaying organic matter that's on the bottom. Bass know where the crayfish live. They move in to eat the crayfish. It's the whole life cycle of the water system. You know, fish eat crayfish. It's a, fish eat fish world out there. So you got to fish where the fish are to catch them. So that's the tube jigs. When I'm rigging a tube jig, there's a couple ways I rig it. This is a round ball jig head, okay? There's many different style jig heads out there. Tube jigs are hollow. Did you guys notice that when I pass this around, okay? The actual way that I fish all my tube jigs for largemouth, smallmouth in the springtime is I'll actually insert the jig head inside the tube, and I'll pass this back around. Slide it all the way up to the top so there's no space in there. And I won't throw this one at you because I don't want to hook you. And that's how I fish my tube. A lot of you might say, well, that's how I fish smallmouth in the summertime out in Lake Ontario, Cayuga Lake, Canandaigua Lake. A lot of people fish smallmouth with tube jigs like that, okay? Well, that works extremely well for largemouth. It works extremely well for smallmouth, as a lot of people know. You catch trout on those. You catch perch on those. Anything that swims will eat a tube jig. So it just depends on where you're fishing and how you want to fish it. But I suggest round ball jig heads. Reason being is a round ball jig head, when you put it in a tube jig, it's going to make that tube fall straight to the bottom. all right? There's several different styles of heads. There's gumdrop heads, there's darter heads that are a little bit longer in diameter, they're cylinder in shape, okay? What those tend to make those tube jigs do when you sink, they glide to the side, They might glide a little further with a gumdrop head or a darter head, depending on how you have them in there. I like the round ball head because I can make it do anything I want it to do. With the darter heads or the longer cylinder shaped heads, you only have certain retrieves you can get out of those. You throw it out and let it sink, you pull it, it's going to kind of go side to side. Can't really jig it because the head design isn't allowing you to get the actual jigging motion out of it. With the round ball jig head, you throw it out there, it's going to sit on the bottom. You want to jig it, it's going to hop and stop, hop and stop, hop and stop, and it's going to go in the direction you're pulling it. Now, I'm not saying that the darter heads and the cylindrical shaped heads aren't any good. They're great in certain times. But 90% of the time, a round ball jig head will outfish the rest of them. So that's what I suggest for tube jigs. I'll show you this one. This is like a darter head. It's actually an old spinnerbait head that I just cut, and I used the wire for something else, and I had it laying around, so I inserted it in the tube jig. But that's what a darter head shape is going to look like. Again, it's elongated. When that goes through the water, what it doesn't allow the bait to do on that small tube jig, you notice that the bait bends a little bit. With that one, it's not going to bend. It's going to be a more rigid bait. So when it's falling, it's going to glide. With the round ball head, just sink straight down to the bottom, okay? That's how I like to fish my tubes. I fish them on 6-pound to 10-pound test. I don't go really anything heavier than that. On average, I use 8-pound test. That's what this is 8-pound test. I have real good success with 8-pound test. I mean, I fish around trees and docks with it. Unless you get a 6-7-pound largemouth or a big giant smallmouth, you know, and he's going to go up under a dock, you know, you're taking a risk of fishing around that. But, you know, I'm fortunate enough to know how to pull them out and have had experience and lost a few fish because I wasn't doing it right the first few times, and learned how to fish it a little bit differently. Usually I can get anything out with 8-pound test, and again, because I have access to a boat, if I get a fish stuck underneath a tree or a dock post or something, I'll actually go in to where the fish is, reach down and grab the fish and untangle them. A lot of people that are fishing from the shore may not have that access. Fishing from a dock may not have that access if they're casting to another dock. So if you're going to fish around heavier structure, I would suggest 10-pound test. What the heavier line allows you to do is give a little bit more force on that fish, direct that fish in the direction you want to go, keep them from going into the trees, keep them from going into the weeds, you know, keep them from wrapping around a dock post or a tree log. So there's advantages and disadvantages to heavier line. Again, the heavier line with these finesse style baits is going to make that bait fall slower. So if you are fishing shell, you want your bait to fall a little slower, you can beef it up to 10-pound. You can even go to 12-pound test if you want, but when you're getting up to that heavier line, the bait loses action. It becomes it's just falling and moving, falling and moving. The lighter the line is, the more action you can impart on that bait. Where you twitch it, it's going to hop and drop, hop and drop. With a heavier line, you twitch it, it's going to hop and arc and fall. It's not going to get that erratic movement, that erratic motion that the fish are looking for. That's not making it look a little bit different than everything around it. See, bass are opportunistic feeders. They're going to feed on something that's wounded, sick, or dying before they chase something down that's going Mach speed away from them because they're exerting too much energy to chase that bait. All right? They want something sitting in front of their face. Crayfish, the claws are up, it's a defensive act, okay? Bass don't care. They'll roll them over, nip at them till they get them backwards, and they'll suck them in backwards, tail first. That's how bass eats a crayfish. They'll chew on them, they'll spit them out, suck them back in. Bass will eat pretty much anything they can get their mouths around. And again, if it's sitting in front of them, they're going to eat it. Bass, smallmouth, largemouth, again, they're opportunistic feeders, like I said. If they're not biting and you can actually see them and you're not spooking them away, you can make a bass bite. It's like aggravating somebody. You keep poking a person, eventually that person's going to tell you, get away from me. They might even swing at you. Well, a bass is about the same way. You keep throwing at a fish, you see him sit next to a log, you keep throwing at him. Might take you 5 casts, might take you 10 casts, might take you 30 casts. But if that fish is big enough and you want a picture with that fish, make it repeated casts at that fish, try different angles, try different bait styles, try different colors, And you can usually aggravate that fish into biting. Bass get aggravated and they will strike at things to move them away from themselves, kill it, not to eat it. And at that point in time, it's a real fast strike, so you got to pay attention. When you're fishing like that, obviously sight fishing is a huge part in that. Good pair of polarized glasses is a big part in bass fishing. You're always looking in the water. You're always looking for weeds. You're always looking for rocks. You're always looking for sand, rock, weed mix. So a good pair of polarized glasses help with that. I happen to be associated with a company called Haber Vision. If anybody interested in some glasses, I have some business cards that have a discount code of 55% or more discount per glasses. I see a few of you have prescription glasses. They make prescription glasses as well. And the coupon code is good for all of those. So feel free to grab some cards over there. They have the little coupon code. I'll explain that in the end. But a good pair of polarized glasses is crucial no matter what time of the year you are bass fishing, trout fishing, pan fishing. A couple of reasons. Your eyes are the only eyes you have. You know, they have all these new surgeries that you can prevent your eyes from going bad as long as you possibly can, but who wants surgery? Get yourself a good pair of glasses, whether they're Haber Visions, they're Oakleys, they're Solar Bats, they're a no-name brand off the sunglass rack and in the mall. Good pair of glasses that blocks out the UV light, is polarized, helps you see, helps cut out the glare, will help protect your eyes when you're on the water, fishing near the water. I don't know how many of you ever fish and get a headache when you're fishing because you don't have sunglasses on. It's the glare off the water affecting your eyes. Always wear sunglasses. I get in the habit of wearing sunglasses all the time, and when I don't have them on, even an overcast, glary day will affect my eyes, and I have to put my sunglasses on because my eyes get accustomed to wearing the shades all day long. So that's how I like to fish them. Next thing we're going to talk about is wacky worm fishing. Now, this is a technique that works spring through fall, all right? When I say wacky worm, a lot of people think about Senkos or a soft stick style bait. Throw that around there. That's an actual Senko, okay? Or a Sticko, Bass Pro Shop Sticko. There's Gander Mountain brands that they use. That's a heavy worm. That worm by itself probably weighs a ½ ounce as it is because of the salt content inside of it. You stick a hook in it, you throw it out, that thing will sink about 1.5 feet per second, all right? When I say wacky worm in the springtime, I don't mean Senkos. Senkos, you can catch them out of Senko. If you have them, feel free to use them. They're not gonna not work. What I use in the springtime for sight fishing, when the water gets warm, when the fish are on their beds, post-spawn, that means post-spawn is after they've spawned, they're coming off their beds, they're still shallow, they're cruising the banks. I use Zoom trick worms or any other floating style of worm, okay? I'll throw this one around. You can feel the difference in texture between that worm and the Senko, all right? You can feel the weight difference, all right? And the other thing that I like about non-salted floating worms, and see how that hangs on the hook? When that gets in the water, that worm straightens out like this, okay? And then when that worm's straight and you twitch that hook, just a little teeny tiny twitch with your rod tip, that worm's going like this, just dancing in that water, okay? Because it doesn't weigh anything and the worm tends to float, I use a 1/0 or smaller hook. I'll pass this around. These are sharp hooks. Don't stick yourself. Because that's such a small hook, that worm almost floats, okay? It suspends, sinks super, super slow. And what that allows you to do in the shallow water is keep that bait in the fish's face longer. The longer that bait is in that fish's face, the easier it is to make them bite it. All right? Shallow water fishing is kind of a science. There's a lot of people that try to do it but don't successfully do it because they're using the wrong bait styles, using the wrong bait selection. When I'm fishing shallow, I fish the lightest lures possible. If I'm using a jig and pig, I'll use a 1/4 ounce instead of a ½ ounce. I'll use an 1/8 ounce instead of a 1/4 ounce. Zoom trick worms, they're floating worms. Gambler makes a floating worm that works extremely well for trick worm fishing. There's many other companies out there. There's a lot of no-name companies out there that make worms that float. Doesn't matter what brand you're using as long as it's a worm that floats. There's 4-inch models of that. That's a 7-inch model. Those are that's actually my size to go to because it's 7 inches long. It weighs about a 1/4 ounce, so you can actually cast it. That I highly suggest using on a spinning rod because you might be able to cast it on a bait caster, but you're not going to get the distance you want. All right, when I use a spinning rod, I'm using a medium to medium light. Maybe I might go as heavy as a medium heavy rod. Medium light is, a 6 to 10 pound line rated rod. A mediums, might be 8 to 12, maybe 8 to 14. Medium heavy is 10 to like 17 pound test line weight range on a rod. Obviously, medium light's got a real light action, a lighter backbone. Backbone is this portion of the rod. It's the strength of the rod. That's your tip action of the rod, okay? Medium, obviously a little stiffer. Medium heavy is usually real stiff. It's got a little bit more pulling power to it. I like a rod with like a little bit of tip in it. A little bit. See how that tip flexes? You're getting about 6 to 10 inches worth of tip flex out of that. What that allows you to do with these wacky worms, these zoom trick worms, is you throw it out there and you make a real quick little jerk. See how that tip's whipping? You're not actually moving that bait real far. You might be moving it that much, maybe ½ inch to an inch in movement forward towards you, but that bait's going like this. It's pulsing. And when you see fish up shallow when they're on their beds, if they're cruising the shoreline, throw it past them, in front of them. When you throw a bait behind the fish and bring it from their tail to their head, it's not natural. Prey for bass usually swim away or across their path, not from behind to their face. Fish, tend to get a little leery of that, and well, this isn't natural. Why is it swimming into my mouth instead of away from my mouth? So sometimes they won't bite it that way. I'm not saying it doesn't always work, but most of the time they won't bite it if you're throwing behind them and bring it to their face. So you either want to throw it past them and bring it across. The fish is facing this way, throw it here, work it across, or throw it here and bring it towards them. A lot of times bass kind of think they're hiding, sit next to a log. They do that for reasons to hide from prey, ambush style feeders again. All right, throw that bait out there, twitch, 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 get in front of that fish and just let it sit there, let it die, let it sink, twitch, 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 let it sink. All right, one thing that I learned over the years when you're sight fishing for bass, especially in the springtime, if you see a bass in the water, you can see him real clearly, and you're looking at him, and none of his fins are moving. He's just sitting there. Pectorals, dorsal, and tail fins are just flat out. You don't see them wavering at all. And usually means they're not that active and they probably won't bite your bait. But if you throw your bait in there and you see the fins start going like this, dorsal fin starts going like this, the tail will actually undulate and not move, that fish is interested, okay? That fish will bite. It might take 3 or 4 casts to get that fish to bite, but they will bite. So just don't make one cast at that fish, make multiple casts at that fish. Again, change the angle of your retrieve. Maybe change colors. As you can see, I have a lot of wacky looking color worms up here. That's where the name wacky worm came from. Color and the way you fish it, all right? You might be asking, that's extremely bright. I like to say this makes the fish go blind. This is one of those colors that if they're not biting something else, this is one of those ones that makes them mad, and you put it in their face enough, they're gonna get this thing out of my face, I'm gonna bite it, move it off. This color is not a color that I would recommend buying unless you're getting really active into wacky worm fishing. I've had this bag for probably 5 years, and I do catch fish on it, but there's extreme occasions where it works, and most of the time it doesn't because it's so bright. That's called merthiolate, that color, all right? There's another color that's a little less bright. It's called bubblegum. It's like a pink-white mix combination. It's like a milky pink. It's actually very similar to the color of your shirt. That's a real good color worm to use. I like yellow. Yellow works pretty well. And then you go in your natural colors. The one I was passing around is Junebug. The other one's actually a bullfrog color. It's like a lime green with a green pumpkin top with a little black flake. And then this is an interesting color. It's a black, brown, red, gold, copper flake. I like the natural dark colors with a lot of heavy metal flake. Reason why I like a lot of the metal flake, which is the flashy part of the worm, is because I could throw it out there, and when I twitch that worm, I can see the metal flake flashing. But again, at the same time, it's a natural color, base color worm. The fish tend to eat it a little bit better than the brighter colors. But when I'm wacky worming, I like to see where that bait is visually because it's so light. Unless they actually pick that bait up and swim off with it, most of the time you're not going to feel them biting it. So you're visually watching them open their mouth, closing their mouth, and the bait disappearing. That's when you set the hook. Sometimes you'll feel them swim off, feel them, strike it. But most of the time, you actually have to physically see the worm, watch them suck it in, and watch them eat it. And then you set the hook, like I said. So that's why I like the worms with the heavy metal flake. They're easy to see from a long distance away. Go ahead, no problem. They're easy to see from a long distance away. When the water is a little bit murkier or the fish aren't as aggressive and you want to make them mad, that's when I go with the yellow. That's when I go with the wild merthiolate color here. And then I basically make the fish mad. Excuse my language, piss them off per se, and make them eat. All right. Then there's other style worms that I like to use from time to time. This is called a whiptail worm. It's a little bit different of an action. It's got a real fat head. It goes down to a real thin, super fine tail, okay? That one, when you twitch that, the head's gonna go like this, the tail's gonna go like this. So a little bit different of an action. Makes the fish look at it a little differently. It's good to try variations of worm styles and sizes, all right?
Alex, when you actually use these different kind of worms, do you always hook them in the middle or do you hook them in the front?
You could hook them in the front, you could hook them in the back. When I'm sight fishing, I like hooking them in the middle because it gives it a little bit of a different action, a little different reaction. The fish tend to act towards them, okay? When you hook them in the middle, they also fall differently. That whole worm's falling like this. If you hook it in the nose, that hook's gonna tend to take that worm, turn it, and that hook's gonna drag that worm to the bottom, okay? You can work it like that. A lot of times that's better than wacky worming, all right? What that will do with a floating worm, if you nose hook it, if you nose hook it here, worm's gonna fall like this, and then that tail of that worm's up in the air, and you jig it, the hook's gonna bounce, the tail is gonna wiggle, it's gonna bounce, gonna wiggle, bounce and wiggle, okay? That's not a bad pattern to try. I would suggest trying the wacky worm first. If that doesn't work, try varying your hook presentation in the bait. When I wacky worm, I like to do dead center. Try to pinch it, try to make it symmetrical on both sides, and then you get the best action out of it. It bounces and wiggles, all right? If you look at some of these zoom worms, there's kind of like, they call it a milk sack on a night crawler. I don't know if you guys know what that portion is. It's a little smooth ring. When you hook it, the worm's gonna sit like that. Again, it's gonna have a little bit different action to it. It acts a little differently when you twitch it. So it's nice way to hook it. Again, you can nose hook it, and it's gonna fall, it's gonna dance a little differently. And you could tail hook them, depending on how the shape of the worm. If you look at these zoom worms, for instance, it's thick, thin, and a little bulbous, meaty end to it, all right? That has a little bit of different action, so if you hook it there, it's gonna act a little bit differently as opposed to hooking it ahead and fishing it backwards, all right? This technique works the best when the water is 60 degrees or warmer. Again, the fish have to be shallow. The fish are on their beds. The fish are cruising, getting ready to find a bed, find a spot to make a bed in, or they're in post spawn when they're coming off their bed, getting ready to go back out to the main drop-offs, the main lake, go back into the spots where they sit for the summer. And when they're cruising the shoreline, they're kind of looking for anything to eat. This is an easy presentation to throw in at them. It doesn't make a big splash in the water. They skip very well, so if you're fishing around docks, you can skip them a country mile. They'll skid right across the surface. They don't spook a lot of fish. Easy for the bass to suck in. I mean, this big worm, you even catch 3-4 inchers on these things. They suck them in and chew on them all day long. So it's a good presentation style to use. Again, as you move a little deeper, if you're fishing 5-6 feet of water, then I would move with the Senko. The Senko is a little bit heavier of a bait. It'll sink a little faster. 5-6 foot of water, wacky worming. The fish most of the time aren't sitting at the surface. They're a little bit deeper. So you're going to want to use the Senko. The Senko is going to sink a little bit faster, especially if it's a windy day. The Senko will sink a little faster, get down a little deeper. Using one of these zoom floating worms on a windy day, the wind will catch your line and just kind of float it across the surface, and it'll never make it down. So that's when you go to the Senkos.
Now the bass, their spawning time is like May to June, something like that?
It's not month orientated, it's temperature orientated.
Right.
Yeah, basically May is when the water tends to warm up the most and gets into that range. For a bass, biologically, when the water gets to about 62 degrees, they get in the mode, okay, it's time to start finding a place to make a nest, time to start fanning out the bed, they call it. They start making their hole in the ground. And basically, you look out in the water, you might see something that looks like an inner tube sitting on the bottom. That's an actual nest that a fish has fanned out with their tail. They knocked all the sand away to get to the gravel beneath it, or knocked the mud away to get to the log beneath it, and that's where they're making their nest. That's where they're going to lay their eggs, okay? That all happens at 62 degrees. Once it hits 65 degrees, bass automatically, it's genetic. They start laying their eggs. They get ready to do their business and reproduce. 65 to 72 degrees, when a bass lays their eggs, takes 3 to 7 days to hatch. I don't know if you guys knew that. 3 days with proper temperature and sunlight penetration, the eggs will hatch in 3 days. Improper sunlight penetration and temperature fluctuations, they'll hatch in 7 days. All right? Once those eggs hatch, they become fry. The male bass will guard the nest with the eggs in there, and once they hatch, the male bass will also stick with the fry and guard the fry for a couple of weeks till they get big enough. And at times, once that male bass leaves that pot of fry, he'll actually turn and eat the fry. It's a dog-eat-dog world out there. The bass eat anything that moves, and if it fits in their mouth, they're going to eat it. They eat their own kind. Post-spawn, early summer pattern, crankbaits that are largemouth bass coloration work extremely well in all the lakes around here in New York State and even in southern lakes, okay? And before we go too far off the wacky worm topic, this is a fantastic style and technique to use in farm ponds, little rivers, and anything that has bass in it. Especially now, the bass in the ponds, they're literally sitting on the shoreline in 6 to 10 inches of water on their beds. You walk down the shoreline, you look parallel with the shoreline as you're walking down it, look for the fish sitting there, stand a few feet back, cast at them, see if they bite. Most of the time they will. Set the hook. You might catch the biggest bass of your life. Again, bass aren't in season right now. It's catch and release only. Take a picture, let them go. A lot of people don't like fishing for bass in the springtime. It doesn't do anything to them. It doesn't hinder them. When you catch them, you'll release them, they swim right back to the nest. It's just one of the things that they do. So you're not.
Didn't they have a law that said you, about aggravating the bass or something?
That used to be the old style law. A couple years ago, they came in with a new law because everybody was bass fishing anyways. They would just say, I was fishing for anything that bites. Well, the bass, when you catch a bass in the springtime, you release them. They did studies where they taken a bass, taken them 2 miles down the lake. Later that day, that same exact bass was back on the same exact bed that it was on that morning. So the bass will return to the spot where their nest is. They don't swim too far, even if you aggravate them, because they know, I got to get back. It's instinct. I got to get back, protect my babies, keep them alive, and try to make them reproduce and become fish themselves. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell. Any questions about anything?
I know this is about bass, but I fish for northern a lot.
Okay.
Questions about leaders, whether they're really important or not. I was fishing with live perch, and one of my son's buddies put on a clear leader. It was really heavy test line, and sure enough, he caught the biggest northern I've ever seen. Can the fish really see those leaders?
Yes. Fish can see leaders, especially steel leaders. They sometimes, depending, they're black, they're silver. Some of them, I've seen gold leaders before. They're gold or silver coated with rubber nylon. I suggest trying to fish for pike with either a real heavy-duty fluorocarbon leader if you can get away with it. You're still going to take the chance of getting ripped off with fluorocarbon leader, but most of the time they won't. If you're using a moving bait, you're using a spinnerbait or a crankbait, a lot of times the pike will come in and swipe at it, not rip you off. You have the chance to hook them in the mouth, and the corner of the mouth is actually the best place to hook a pike, because when they're shaking their head, usually they can't get that line wrapped around their face and through their teeth. I've caught many pike bass fishing, hooked them in the corner of the mouth, on 6, 8 pound tests, 10, 15, 20 pounders I've caught up to, and land them. So.
You don't use leaders with?
I don't use leaders with bass fishing tackle whatsoever. So, any other questions? All right, guys. Well, I appreciate your attendance here, and.
I do have one question. Now my friend uses the El Cincos, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I've tried to use them both ways, through the head and the Wacky style, and I don't catch that much of them. But the zoom, the pumpkin,
Mm-hmm.
the green pumpkin, I have a lot of luck with those with the wiggly tail.
Yep.
More so than the El Cinco now, and I hook them through the head. I don't use the
Yep.
the wacky style. I don't know why that is. You know?
Well, bass fishing, it's part technique, part knowing where to fish, and then there's a confidence level in there with what you're fishing with, and that's a huge part of it. If you're not confident in the bait you're fishing with, you've never caught a fish on it, you might be apprehensive to fishing it for an extended period of time, so you may not be giving it the best shot or the best look for the fish to take a peek at it, and so that might be the reason why you're not catching them. Again, you may not be in the right spot either, so there's a big difference with that as well. You might not be fishing it in the right depth. You might not be fishing it close enough to the shoreline. So there's variations in everything. So you just vary your retrieve, vary your technique.
What about sinkers?
Sinkers, you mean?
Do you use, when you're fishing with the rubber, the worms and stuff, do you use sinkers? Or
When I'm fishing wacky style, I don't. But if I'm fishing a Texas rig rubber worm, I use anywhere from a 1/4 ounce up to a 1 ounce bullet sinker. Carolina rig, I use egg sinkers, bullet sinkers, depending on the bottom structure if I'm fishing around weeds or rocks or whatever. So I will use sinkers, yes. Depending on, again, when I'm fishing, I might peg the sinker so it doesn't slide up and down the line. That's good for real heavy weeds because when you throw it in the weeds, if you're using a big 10-inch rubber worm, the worm might get caught in the weed, the sinker might slide down the line, and you think you have a bite, but your sinker's 3 or 4 feet away and your worm's way over here, and your rod's over here, you set the line, set the hook, I should say, that sinker slings up, that hook over here might only move 2 or 3 inches and not have enough pressure to set the hook on the fish. But when you keep that sinker pegged to that worm's either going to be stuck in the weeds and fall down together, and when you get that bite, you set the hook, you're actually pulling on the fish directly and not pulling up 3 feet of line, having leverage on the line from a sinker flopping around on it and trying to pull the hook at the same time. So there's a few different ways to fish stuff. I don't peg my sinkers if I'm fishing a weed line. I'll make a long cast parallel with a weed line, not in the weeds, but next to the weeds. The reason why I don't peg them that way is if you're using a big 10-inch rubber worm, bass will come in, grab that worm, suck that worm in, and that line will actually slide through that sinker. So they don't feel as much resistance, so it feels a little bit more natural to them. And then you set the hook there, and if your sinker's that far in front of the worm and you set the hook, you're going to have a direct contact with that fish. But if you've got 5 or 6 feet worth of line between that fish and that sinker, you're going to have that floppy motion again, and you're not going to get a good hook set on them. So obviously, you can get a bite, open your barrel, and let the fish swim away with it. You get a bite with soft plastic, set the hook right away. So, okay? Any other questions? All right. Well, I got a few things for you guys here. I appreciate you for showing up. These are a couple giveaways here. These are Stanley Ribbit Top Toads. You all got your business cards there with a number on them. I'm going to pick 9 and 3. Who's got 9 and 3? 9 circled. Those are for you. Those are for you. I appreciate you guys showing up. Just a little token of my appreciation to keep you guys interested and coming back. They do sell those here in the store. They work great. I highly suggest buying several packs of them. They're good springtime, late springtime, early summer. I'm going to give another seminar in June on frog fishing and summer techniques. It's going to cover frogs, it's going to cover jig and pig, going to cover rubber worm fishing. I'm going to cover Carolina fishing, Carolina rig fishing, and possibly some deeper style crankbait fishing with baits that dive anywhere from 5 to 10, 12 feet deep. So that's the next seminar coming up in June. Again, I have a pad and a pen up there. If you've never been to my seminars before and I don't have your email address, please feel free to leave your email address. I'll put you in my emailing list. Feel free to bring your friends. I'm open to anybody that wants to come. I highly encourage you bringing children to the seminars. Youth of today are fishermen of tomorrow. They keep the sport going. They keep places like Gander Mountain, Dick's, and all the other sporting goods store going. Especially when I was a kid, that was the place I wanted to go. I didn't want to go to the toy store. I wanted to go to the fishing section and all the stores that I walked in, and I wasn't happy till I walked out with $10 worth of lures. But that was me as a kid. If you can get your kid enrolled in some sort of fishing activity, helps give them direction in life, helps give them something to look forward to. And also, if they get in trouble, you can always take it away from them, and it usually kind of straightens them out a little bit. So I highly suggest that. Appreciate you showing. Thank you. Hope you all enjoyed it.